Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Tom Winston, Dragos' Director of Intelligence. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Megan. Thank you very much. And thank you all for spending some time on a Friday afternoon to take a listen to the webinar, 4 Qualities of Good Cyber Threat Intelligence. First, we'll look at the overview. Today, we're going to discuss cyber threat intelligence. You'll learn everything about the dimensions of cyber threat intelligence. We'll talk about sourcing and confidence in threat intelligence. We'll also talk about how to apply the diamond model to cyber threat intelligence, as well as how threats differ across various industries. First of all, what is threat intelligence? Well, most of you, when you hear the word intelligence, you may think of people in trench coats meeting other people late at night on the street corner to get information. That's a very old sort of definition for what intelligence is. Threat intelligence is very different. It is the actionable knowledge and insight on adversaries and their malicious activities, enabling defenders and their organizations to reduce harm through better security decision-making. So the goal of threat intelligence is to basically not only determine if there's an adversary present, but offer suggestions for remedy and change. Hold on a second. Okay. Small issue there. Yeah, so generic threat intelligence isn't really good enough in the industrial control system environment. So the other thing to sort of keep in mind here is that there's really no universal threat intelligence, and threat intelligence really depends greatly on context. So there's threat intelligence for enterprise IT, and that's actually a very commonly understood thing. And fortunately or unfortunately, however you want to look at it, for industrial control systems, that's very different. That's a very different sort of thing. Threat intelligence requires context, and there should always be some sort of action from any discovered threats in this sort of paradigm. So there'll be threat assessments, and there'll be some sort of impact statement and some sort of recommended action or mitigation. And understand that industrial control systems represent a different sort of environment, a much more complex environment. And the most important thing with industrial control system environments, or sometimes we refer to them as operational technology environments, is asset visibility and asset identification. So really the goal always is with threat intelligence, it's not just to provide information for a policymaker, as in the old intelligence paradigm, to make a decision about something, but instead it's actually to provide actionable things that can be done to prevent the adversary from either gaining access to your organization or persisting in your organization or getting further into your organization. And of course, I think this is probably the same with any type of intelligence. Not all threat intelligence is equal. Sometimes good threat intelligence should really always follow this notion of CART. And we'll talk about CART in a few minutes, but organizations consuming high quality threat intelligence should be able to leverage it across their cybersecurity programs to improve detections, responses to those detections, prevention, informing the most technical offenders and operators to the most strategic decision makers. So, and again, high quality threat intelligence applied diligently can differentiate mediocre programs from really good cybersecurity programs. And regarding industrial control networks, where the impact of cybersecurity incident can mean millions in business losses, reputational damage, environmental disasters, certainly in the context of oil, natural gas, or nuclear, or loss of life, the diligent application of high quality threat intelligence is it's a necessity. So the 4 primary qualities of CART are completeness, accuracy, relevance, and timeliness. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes here. With good threat intelligence, organizations can, sort of benefit from improved detection. So that's the folks working in the organization who are actually looking at and writing the detections, IOCs, YARA signatures, that sort of thing. Response, or sometimes it's called incident response. That would be the defenders who are responding to active incidents and looking at things that are occurring in real time, typically, sharing critical information with technical defenders and strategic decision makers. Of course, that's always the goal, but really the goal for good cyber threat intelligence is response and prevention. And of course, to do those things, we need to have good detection. And of course, the thing with, I mentioned before about halting operations. We saw some halting of operations with the enterprise IT attack on Colonial Pipeline. It can cost millions in damage. There's been several incidents where this has occurred in the industrial environment with the Trisis attack, for an example. Damaged reputation, this is another issue too. From a business perspective, the owner-operators don't want their reputation damaged. They want to be known as a reliable provider of whatever service they're providing. So loss of life or environmental disaster is a much bigger deal. That actually, we hope we never see that, but there is always a possibility of that, even if it's a secondary or tertiary effect. So for instance, when the Ukraine power grid was attacked several years back, the folks were without power in January, which is a very cold, dark time in that country. So the secondary or tertiary effect of that could be loss of life. So this is a very serious thing, certainly from the industrial control systems operational technology standpoint. It's serious in the enterprise IT environment too, but the outcomes or impacts may be a little different. In the enterprise IT environment, we may see a denial of service, we may see a website down, we may see something like that. Whereas in the operational technology environment, we can see, unfortunately, we can see the things that I mentioned here, which we hope we don't see, but it's always a concern. So how do we assess threat intelligence? What's the way we go about doing this? And there's a whole bunch of dimensions we're going to look at here. But really, the most important thing is completeness, accuracy, relevance, and timeliness. And these things aren't always sometimes it's actually hard to get completeness, for instance. And that just means the intelligence must be sufficiently complete to provide effective decision-making, detection, and hopefully prevention. Accuracy, of course, threat intelligence must save organizations more in success than it costs them in errors or mistakes. So we want to have a high level of accuracy. Relevance, threat intelligence must address a threat to the organization, some sort of method that allows for effective action, and intelligence addressing threats faced by organization. If it's of no value, then it's not a very sort of accurate use of the time. And threat intelligence delivered in a type or method usable by the organization that isn't shared with others, in other words, shared with other owner operators, tends to not be very helpful either. So we want to make sure that it's relevant. We want to make sure that it's relevant to the context in the organization. We want to make sure that the organization has, some vested interest in disseminating that information with other similar organizations. So for instance, if you have an electric vertical that's being attacked by a certain type of malware, it's really helpful to share that. Now, of course, timeliness makes the most sense for most people because everybody knows that when an incident occurs, you're usually on some sort of tight clock. And that's a huge issue if you're trying to do something in real time. If you're working in incident response, timeliness is always going to matter. One note though, timeliness sometimes it's not a binary issue. None of these are actually binary. It's not like you either have it complete or it's not complete. They're all kind of on scales. And timeliness is a good example of this gradient because some intelligence, maybe more strategic intelligence, has a more fluid timeliness requirement. In other words, it can be delayed by a couple hours or even a couple days, maybe even a couple weeks. Whereas tactical threat intelligence, however, has much stricter requirements, much stricter time requirements. So when Dragos releases an advisory alert, we pretty much have a turnaround time from discovery of incident to publication of 2 to 4 hours. So just as an example, that's a pretty quick turnaround. Whereas a more strategic piece may take a couple weeks to produce. And of course, cyber threat intelligence is knowledge. It's the outcome of the analytic process using some hypothesis-led and evidence-based analysis from a variety of data sources. We'll talk about data sources actually in a couple minutes. That becomes the data sources and source reliance becomes an issue sometimes, unfortunately, in this particular situation. Not unlike other intelligence, though, it's hypothesis-led. So there's a key intelligence question or key intelligence questions that the analysts and hunters in an organization they'll come to the conclusion and they'll determine that that's what they want to kind of pursue. So whatever data they're collecting will be related to that hypothesis. Also, cyber threat intelligence produces insights on adversaries and their malicious activity. Most importantly, maybe it enables defenders and their organizations to improve their security decision-making and reduces harm when teams use the insight to improve their entire cybersecurity posture. When properly integrated into a security program, threat intelligence or cyber threat intelligence reduces both the mean time to recovery during an incident and the adversary dwell time. Now, adversary dwell time is a real tricky bit of business because we've seen with ransomware attacks over the past couple of years that the attackers actually get in the systems sometimes many days or weeks, even months before the ransom occurs. So really what we're trying to do is we want to find these good cyber threat intelligence will reduce that dwell time, which maybe reduces the ability of the adversary to cause harm or damage to the systems. Both metrics, though, are of high interest to ICS, asset owner operators, and information technology operators. So really, these metrics always matter. Cybersecurity is a very metrics sort of driven institution, I guess we could call it, because we want to know that we're actually effectively stopping adversaries in real time. So a lot of it's like weather forecasting. Organizations, individuals can shelter and prepare for a coming storm or tornado. Think of a tornado as a tactical issue because that's going to occur in the next 20, 30 minutes. Or when a snowstorm is predicted, anybody who lives in kind of the middle Atlantic or the southern United States knows that this can be a real problem because you have to strategically plan what you're going to do for that snowstorm. So it's just a nice, very easy to sort of understand paradigm. And really the whole notion always is enabling the defenders to better prepare and protect themselves. So cyber threat intelligence, of course, this is typical of many intelligence, any intelligence discipline, actually. We're always concerned about the who, what, where, when, why, and how. And of course, the who is, who are the adversaries, who are the actors, who are the sponsors, employers, the what adversaries use, including their technical capabilities, and infrastructure. That's a very technical discussion, actually, the what, where adversaries target, detailing industries, verticals, and geographic regions. So this is actually, the where is interesting because it's actually a blend of traditional intelligence, actually traditional intelligence analysis and cyber threat intelligence. So, because then we're actually looking at what's this country like? What do they do? What are they known to do? What's their strategic goal? What's their the vector by which they want to attack? What's their political interest? What's their motivation? When adversaries act, identifying when is sort of when they act, identifying their timelines and their patterns of life. This can be tricky. Figuring out how, when they're acting and what their pattern of life is not easy. This takes lots of time on target sometimes. The why, of course, we want to know the motive and intent, but I think I would argue that the motive and intent are the two most difficult things to actually determine, especially when we're looking at OT threats, because many OT threats originate in IT environments. And the question we always ask ourselves is, well, was the intent to attack the operational technology, or did they stumble upon it? And then they said, oh, wow, we got this really cool thing here. Let's look at it. So finding motive and intent is a very difficult thing in threat intelligence. It's hard to do with tools, off-the-shelf tools, as we'll discuss in a minute. Very hard to do. And of course, how adversaries operate focused on their behaviors and patterns. That tends to be something that we would look for in trends analysis. Who's attacking organizations in the United States? Who's attacking organizations in the Middle East? Who's attacking organizations in Australia? These are the sorts of things that you may look at if you're focusing on how they're acting. It's related actually to the when too, the patterns of life. So the 3-question rule, very simple. What's the threat? So we address those 5 questions. What's the impact? Now, impact always matters. And I have to make a comment here about impact. Many times you'll hear people use the term sophisticated attackers. It was a sophisticated attack. The problem with that is Sophistication is much less important, honestly, than impact. Impact always matters, especially in the operational technology environment where there could be loss of life or physical destruction of devices. Impact is the only thing we should really be concerned with. Sophistication doesn't mean much in terms of whether the code is, really difficult to read or write, is kind of irrelevant, right? Because what we're really worried about is, well, what can they do to the organization? How's this going to hurt our business? How's this going to hurt other businesses that rely upon us? So those are the things that you really want to watch for. And of course, which actions mitigate the threat, both in the near and the midterm. And sometimes we'll take actions, we'll write detections, we'll put detections, in the platform, and then we'll notice that something changes, something strange happens. The adversaries work around the detections. Now that's an interesting thing, because then we get to start peeling away the layers of the motive and intent. If adversaries are spending time looking at our actions to mitigate their threats, that means they're paying attention. That means they're focusing. That means we need to maybe be more concerned. Always a very interesting thing to see when there's updates to tactics, techniques, or procedures, TTPs, or maybe the malware they're using to get initial access to your systems. And of course, cyber threat intelligence lives very closely. It's steeped in context, sort of what's the threat, what proves or disproves the relevance and impact to the audience, and then what's the action? What are we going to do where we see this? So context and action. And we talk about context actually in the diamond model. I'll explain that a little further. I think context may be the most important thing, because from context we can derive, not just the relevance part of CART, but we can also maybe derive some motive or future actions, or predict future actions. So what are some threat intelligence actions? Sometimes the analysts or hunters, threat hunters, adversary hunters, whatever you want to call them, they'll write indicators of compromise. Those are technical elements of information used to enable threat detection, or they'll use threat behavior analytics. That's some sort of system that looks at patterns and trends of malicious activity. And really some of the actions that we would take based on those IOCs or threat behavior analytics would be detective guidance, such as technical indicators, policy guidance. Policy guidance can be interesting because sometimes policy guidance has to be written in a robust fashion that allows for the ever-changing field of cyber threat analytics. So as we're looking at things, we can write a policy, but we have to make sure that the policy covers all the possible actions that we would need to take to protect the organization. Detailed threat behavior to enable hunting for similar behaviors. And again, this is shared information. But I want to preface this. One of the most important actions in cyber threat intelligence or threat intelligence is to share the information so that it's useful for other defenders. Data collection suggestions support effective detection. And of course, we should look at the threat scope and impact details so that we can better inform our risk-based, longer-term thinking, strategic decision-making process. The three categories of cyber threat intelligence, and this is actually interesting at many levels, because typically intelligence practitioners, like when you think of your maybe your clandestine service folks in the Central Intelligence Agency, you think of them in terms of two things actually: tactical and strategic intelligence. And what they do, what those folks do, the folks working in the field, maybe you would say, well, that's the operational part of their job. Well, in cyber threat intelligence, we look at this differently, actually. And I kind of put some context in here just so that you see that there's tactical, operational, and strategic, but also that we have, sort of who does this, who cares about these things, right? So tactical operations or tactical threat intelligence would be security operations, network defenders, and incident response. And a lot of companies, many companies have incident response teams that work in these areas. They look at technical indicators and behaviors to inform the network level action and whatever remediation steps are needed. Operational would be the threat hunters, incident response as well, and security leadership. And this is just looking at adversary behavior, informing holistic remediation. This actually feels longer term, but a lot of times operational threat hunters will find immediate threats. So it's really pretty cool. Behavioral detection, purchasing decisions, data collection, things like that. Purchasing decisions sounds boring and it sounds like it doesn't belong, but actually it does, because a lot of times threat hunters use third-party sources to collect data or get data aggregated for their work. So they want to make sure they're purchasing good sources. Strategic, of course, is security and organizational leadership, places threats into the business context and describes a strategic impact informing risk management and organizational direction. And this is going to differ, of course, across organization. An enterprise IT environment may look very different. Their context may be very different from an operational technology environment. And it's a very interesting, sometimes it's a very interesting division, or sometimes there is no division. We'll talk about that a little bit, because in many instances, we've discovered, with certainly looking at some ransomware attacks over the past year, that enterprise IT and operational technology environments tend to be connected, which creates some sort of issue at a complex level, because then you're looking at the system of IT systems and the system of operational technology systems, and then you have to say, okay, how do these two things interact? That actually becomes a longer, larger strategic conversation, and that's a conversation that I think is very useful and important to have. Now, of course, this shouldn't be any surprise to anybody. There's no one-stop shop for solving the complexities of protecting critical assets in any environment. CTI should always complement detection, response, and prevention. And I say this because threat intelligence alone cannot protect critical assets. And I know in the enterprise IT world, you learn about defense in depth, and you learn about how there's layered defenses that allow for maximum risk mitigation, minimum risk exposure. But it's a little different, actually. This becomes a more complicated conversation in the operational technology world, because there's just a lot of, between the differences in architecture in operational technology, the way the systems are connected, the protocols they use, and the way those systems interact with enterprise IT elements, that actually becomes fairly complicated. But CTI should always complement detection, response, and prevention. And again, this is really focused. CTI is focused on defense. It's always focused on network defense. So there's no universal threat intelligence, and this is also important. So there's no one-stop shop, and there's no universal definition for threat intelligence. You may look threat intelligence up on a different website. You may find a slightly different definition. But intelligence products that are derived from hunting, incident response, those sorts of things, should be tailored for the use cases and security demands of the specific classes of environments. And so in ICS, we look at three: interested adversary, direct ICS threat, and indirect ICS threat. If you think back to those W questions, the who, what, when, where, why, how, you'll realize that this is maybe the how or maybe the why, but it's very difficult. It's actually very, very complicated. The gradations can be complicated between those things. So let's look at them. We know that with interested adversaries, they're doing research. Dragonfly compromises victim networks to gather information on the industrial control system. And that's a very sort of, there's a number of APTs that did the same thing. They're looking at, they're obviously focused. They're spending time, they're collecting information on large, long research and development. And when I investigated interested adversaries, we'll call them in the intelligence community where I worked for many years, I would see countries would start this becoming interested adversaries by spending lots of money on research and development in these areas. And interestingly, a lot of the controllers, a lot of the PLCs, a lot of the stuff that's used, the equipment that's used in operational technology environments has publicly available information on the web. You can find user manuals, you can find control codes, you can find things like that. So this is where the interested adversaries will start their research. And catching them doing that is not a simple thing, because obviously there are many. There's a handful of large producers of this equipment, but there's many others, and it's over time, it's hard to, it's not like you're going to set up a monitor on one company's website just to see if there's interested adversaries coming in. So very, very interesting stuff. That's this mentioning Dragonfly again, this was collecting information, but they haven't been identified disrupting or directly interfacing with the system. So we don't know. Contrast that to crash override, intelligence on threats directly affecting the operation of industrial control systems. So crash override is a malware framework designed and deployed to disrupt the electric power transmission. Now, a comment about this, because ransomware comes up all the time in the news, and it's certainly in the security news every day, I think. It's not clear that ransomware actors, adversaries, intend to directly impact ICS. I would argue that that's more indirect ICS impact. Wherever there's a connection point between the enterprise IT that gets infected by the ransomware and the operational technology, there can be problems. So that would be the indirect ICS impact. Intelligence on threats not associated with industrial control systems, but they have a high likelihood of disrupting their operation. The example here is WannaCry. It doesn't target the systems, but its capability is shown to be debilitating to organizations when it can actually access the operational networks. So great example there of indirect, direct, and interested adversaries. And that's kind of how, from the ICS, operational technology, threat intelligence framework, this is how we look at it. 3 distinguishing products: data sources, visibility, contextual awareness, action, and relevance. Producer must have data sources and visibility into the threats affecting the customer's environment. Without that data, there can be no relevant intelligence. Organizations that don't have large data stores can struggle with this. Actually, if they don't have visibility on the threats, it's kind of hard to know. But of course, there are a number of third-party tools out there that collect information, for instance, on telemetry and maybe PCAP files. Maybe you have some inside line and forensics, for instance, log files, things like that. That stuff helps. That's all very helpful. We'll talk about that. Context, of course, a producer must have an understanding of the customer's business. So with ICS, this poses a unique challenge because each vertical, manufacturing, oil, natural gas, electric, pharma, these verticals have very different environments sometimes, and the complexities of those environments, you really need to have subject matter expertise. And finding the person who's worked in every ICS vertical in their career is fairly unlikely. But I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's fairly unlikely, pretty rare thing. So getting to that contextual awareness can be a challenge, actually. And of course, the producer must understand the customer's operations so that they can recommend the mitigations without causing harm, just simply stating generic best practices. Best practices are nice, and people use that term a lot, but there has to be some contextual awareness and visibility to make that actually work. All right, so let's talk a little bit about intelligence sources. Now, again, when you think of traditional espionage, you think of intelligence sources as being persons, people. Not the case in cyber threat intelligence or threat intelligence. They're typically data sources. I mentioned already they could be PCAP or other forensic artifacts such as log files, or the physical media, mobile phones, laptops, what have you, hard drives. Telemetry or net flow data. But there is an organization that provides really amazing in-depth telemetry and net flow data. They're called Team Cumry, and from that telemetry and net flow, you can actually derive a lot of information. And of course, folks are probably familiar with the Shodan tool. That's a very useful tool for looking at vulnerabilities in control system environments, industrial control system environments. Endpoint devices, if a company produces an endpoint and they have it installed worldwide, which can collect data and provide data for folks who are working in the intel functions in those organizations. And of course, data historians or databases, very important. Data historians are transaction registers in operational technology environments. They show time of transaction, protocol used. You can derive a lot of information from a data historian. So data historian tends to be a very important element in an operational technology environment, and thus it should be guarded. And of course, intelligence sources can have blind spots. There can be collection bias. And collection bias would mean, for instance, if you have a company that only has telemetry in the United States, that's collection bias. We're only getting information from the US. We're not getting information from Europe or Asia, North America, Mexico, South America. We're not getting information from anywhere else. So that can be a problem. And in a like manner, you can have a collection bias in ICS environments by just looking at a port or two ports. I put in Modbus and DMP3 here. That's okay, but that's not going to give you the full picture. You need the full picture. And to get the full picture, sometimes you have to have specific ICS honeypots. You need asset visibility to understand the context. Asset visibility is really key, particularly in operational technology environments. Although I think an enterprise IT manager would argue it's equally important there. Subject matter expertise on intricacies of ICS environments. I mentioned that before. That's going to come up again at the end of my presentation. These environments are different, and depending on whether it's, if you're looking at the water industry, their purification plant's going to look very different from an electrical distribution plant, for instance, or oil and natural gas producer plant. It's just very, very different. So we always have to be aware of these blind spots, and you have to have the ideal situation. Trust me, this is the goal. It's not always the reality. Is to have corroborated data sources, and that's hard. I mean, even in traditional espionage, that's very difficult to get corroboration sometimes. Because typically what occurs in traditional espionage is the officer goes in the field and speaks to the asset and gets information from that person, unless they know everybody, which they may, that asset speaks to on a daily basis. It might be difficult to corroborate the information. So that's actually always a challenge. And corroboration from data sources has a big impact on reliability in assessments. So we'll talk about that next. All sources need confidence levels, and again, good assessments use corroborated sources. Sources should be described in terms of context. If data comes from a third-party tool, you have to attribute any analysis you do in that product, in that written product, to that tool, because obviously that's the right thing to do. You want to give the company credit for providing the data for you. Also, it gives other people who are reading your shared intelligence more context. Maybe they use that tool and maybe they've had similar collection bias or something. And assessments in threat intelligence always require confidence levels. Sherman Kent, CIA School of Analysis, defines confidence level as Kent's words of estimative probability. You've probably heard these words. Everybody's probably heard these words. I'm certain that happened. I'm almost certain that happened. Probably it happened. Probably that country's responsible. Probably that ransomware group did it. You don't hear as much. Strangely, it's actually interesting. It's very interesting because you don't usually hear chances are about even or probably not. And it's important to note that we're talking about intelligence sources and confidence. We're not talking about what's referred to sometimes as low, moderate, high confidence. Everybody wants to have high confidence assessments, but really low confidence assessments are equally or maybe more valid in cyber threat intelligence or threat intelligence analysis. So don't worry about always having the highest level of confidence. That's probably unusual. I know, analytically speaking, certainly when I served in the intelligence community, people wanted to say almost certain as much as they could to policymakers, but it's hard to do that. That's just not always possible. So low confidence is a hypothesis that is supported with available information. The information is likely single sourced and there are known collection information gaps, but this is still a good assessment that's supported. It may not be finished and it may not be appropriate to be the only factor in making a decision. Now, again, low confidence assessment is not a bad thing. This is not, it's not the end of the world. Sometimes it's all you can do. And sometimes it's the best you have. And the best thing to always keep in mind is that low confidence assessments matter as much sometimes as high confidence assessments. So moderate confidence is a hypothesis where you have multiple pieces of information. Collection gaps are significantly reduced. As an intelligence practitioner, whether you're in traditional espionage or whether you're in threat intelligence, cyber threat intelligence, you're always looking for gaps. Gaps matter. Sometimes gaps matter the most. And a gap is an area of intel that you're either missing because of a collection bias or you're missing because you just haven't thought about considering that. The best intelligence analysis, you should always consider that there's probably some gaps. The information may still be single sourced, but there's multiple pieces of data information supporting the hypothesis. That's good. And we've accounted for any gaps that we haven't been able to address. All of them, but we've accounted for some of them, maybe more than we did with the single sourced confidence, the low confidence. High confidence assessments are, like I said, I can't emphasize this enough. They're fairly rare. But in this situation, a hypothesis is supported by a predominant amount of available data and information. It's supported through multiple sources, and the risk of collection gaps are all but eliminated. High confidence assessments are almost never single sourced. There'll always be some collection gap, even if we do not know what it is, but we've accounted for everything possible. So again, even in high confidence assessments, there still probably is a collection gap, and we may or may not be aware of it. So what do we do with all this? Well, what we do with all this is we look toward classification, contextualization. So we want to classify these things now. So, and this is how we at Dragos we use this thing called the diamond model. And I want to sort of spend some time here explaining to you how we classify activity groups. And they're defined as a set of activities or events associated by similarities in their features and weighted in confidence scoring. While other organizations may classify groups based off of similar IOCs, Dragos does things a little differently in the creation of activity groups. For example, we only name activity groups if the adversary aims for or purposely affects ICS or OT as its target. So important point here, we need to see intent. We need to see intent to affect ICS directly. From there, we look at multiple vertices in the diamond model, and you'll see that in a second. Actually, we'll look at it now. We have infrastructure, adversary capabilities, and victims. And analyzing these components give insight to an adversary methodology processes, which can indicate intent. It's also a nice model to use to look at quickly to get a sense of what you're dealing with. So you can see on the left side, we have C2 nodes, domain, hosting. Are they obfuscating anything code? Are they obfuscating their initial access? What have what? Could be anything like that. And then we look at the adversary vertex, association with other groups or actors. What's the home base? Is there a language used? Is there a cultural reference? What are their working hours? What's the pattern of life? Now, working hours matter. So if you see something that's getting attacked at 8 or 9 a.m. XYZ country time, in your country, in your home country, it happens to be 4 a.m., you might have some notion that this is their pattern of life. They start the process, the attacking in the daytime when they go to work in the morning. Now that's obviously almost a perfect, and that would be a perfect world where we had such a one-to-one relationship. Probably not the case. Probably you're gonna have to do a little more research on that. So having that information, pattern of life or working hours may not be enough. Although if you see a language in there, if you see Russian or Chinese or English in there, you know that maybe this is written, maybe the adversary works from that country. That's just something a lot of organizations will do. Capabilities, we look at expertise, operational discipline. Are they changing their code each time they attack? Are they changing their TTPs? Are they obfuscating? Are they hiding? What's the malware type? Is it open source? Is it bespoke? Now, bespoke malware is very well designed malware that is essentially not only focused on ICS environments or operational technology environments, but it shows a high degree of development. Though I won't use the word sophisticated here. Bespoke is the term. Exploit development tools, espionage or disruption, or both. So espionage would be collecting information from nodes. Disruption would be causing those nodes to fail or causing some process failure in the operational technology environment. And then finally, we have the victim, the target description, the parent target objectives. Now remember that these things help context. This diamond model is actually all about context. So then you can say, we think they're using these C2 nodes. They're using Russian fonts. That doesn't mean anything, by the way. It could be anybody using Russian fonts, but it's used. It's actually used to make an assessment, and you plug it into this diamond model, and you can say, this is why we think they're targeting this operational technology vertical. And at Dragos, of course, AGs are only named if the adversary aims for purposely affects IC and or the operational technology of the identified target or targets. So what I show next are a couple examples here of how we did this with real groups. Here we have Parasite. This is an IT and OT network-focused adversary that typically has previously targeted industrial organizations from 2017 to 2020. So here you're seeing, this is interesting because the next slide, you're going to see the evolution of Parasite. So you see that Dragos identified Parasite activity in this time period, 2017 to 2020, identifying and targeting ICS-related entities using known virtual private network vulnerabilities. Parasite infrastructure and capabilities date from at least 2017. Now, this is an interesting problem. We don't know if they dated from before that. We don't know if it was something else before that, and we'll admit that freely. We don't know. We only know what we can see. So if we look at this page here, we'll see that the adversary is adversary-controlled domain, Tor exit node to launch attacks. We don't have any links for who it may be, what if it's a nation state, if it's a group of people, we don't know. Capabilities exploiting known VPN vulnerabilities, SSH, and that sort of thing. And then victims are oil and gas. This matters actually to us very much. Oil and gas, aerospace, utilities, governments, NGOs. And then we see that some of this is happening. The victims that we observed were in the US, Middle East, Australia, and Europe. But then you see how it changes from 2020 to 2021. Okay, the adversary controlled domains utilizing self-signed SSL certificates, that's a change. Capabilities deployment of pay-to-key ransomware, that's a change. And we see that it's still critical infrastructure and oil and gas entities, which means they've focused. And we see also that it's Israel, Europe. Now, in this case, these are unconfirmed, which means we probably weren't able to corroborate the information. But it's still worthy of a conversation, still worthy of an activity group, because we've determined that even over a 4-year period, now we're getting into 5 years, they've been focusing on critical infrastructure, oil and gas entities. So there's obviously directed ICS impact here. They're trying to affect ICS. We can look at another one, Xenotime, which is probably a little more, oops, went by that one too fast. We don't want to do that. Since 2014, this is known for its Trisis attack that caused disruption of an oil and gas facility in Saudi Arabia in August of 2017. We see that their infrastructure, virtual private server, VPS, European web hosting provider, and an Asian shipping company. The adversary was using unique tool development. This is concerning. Capabilities were Trisis, custom credential harvesting, and then off-the-shelf tools. And the victims, of course, were the oil and gas utilities in the Middle East, Europe, North America, and Australia. That's observed in 2018 as they sort of developed over 4 years from 2014. Their activity expanded to include electric utilities in North America and Asia Pacific region. And Xenotime configured Trisis based on specifics and functions of the TriConnex system within the ICS environments. Dragos assessed with moderate confidence. Actually, this is a moderate confidence assessment, so this is cool. Xenotime intends to establish required access and capability to cause potential future disruptive or even destructive event. This matters, and I take a bit of a pause here because the Dragos slogan is safeguarding civilization, and really, if we think that this is actually the intent of the Xenotime activity group, this is huge. This is why we're on this. This is why we're watching it, and this is why we're spending so much time, sort of investigating, hunting, looking for more activity. So how do threats differ across industries? Well, this is actually, I've alluded to this quite a bit, and I've actually kind of discussed this, but every industry is different. the oil, natural gas, electric, pharma, chemical. And there may be some similarities. Listen, there may be similarities between pharma and chemical because both of them are using chemicals to produce something, some output that is, created using other chemicals. I've never personally worked in the pharma or chemical areas. I've investigated and spent a lot of time looking at the electric and LNG facilities. And the environments are different. So what's the difference though? Well, the components used in the networks, the operational technology networks are different. The way those components can be accessed from home, and why do I say from home? Well, interestingly enough, the global pandemic did create a lot of work from home arrangements, even in in many industry verticals. So that required organizations in a very, very short order, unfortunately, to create enterprise IT connectivity into the operational technology environments so that the engineers, the operational technology engineers, could do their work from home or from a remote location. And this actually unfortunately opened the door for some attacks. We saw one such attack last spring of 2021 in Oldsmar, Florida, where somebody was able to get on a controller using TeamViewer app, which was implemented so that people could access the site remotely. This threat actor, who is still unidentified, was attempting to add more sodium hydroxide to the water supply to potentially poison all of the residents of Oldsmar, Florida. Fortunately, the engineer that day wasn't working from home. The engineer was standing right at the console and saw this happening, saw the mouse moving around on the HMI and prevented it. So again, every industry vertical is different. How they access, if they access remotely, is going to be different. So that's why we have to really focus on not just CART, the four great things of good cyber threat intelligence. We also have to focus on a lot of other things, right? We have to focus on, sort of the context of this. What's the context? What's the context of their environment? How are their environments connected? How's the operational technology environment connected to the information technology environment? I know I say that a lot. I probably said that about 30 times this webinar, but I cannot emphasize enough that this is a common recurring issue, and it's something that we always worry about at Dragos. So subject matter expertise, this actually requires, preventing ICS OT threats requires subject matter expertise. So if I look across the employee cadre in Dragos, you'll find people who have years of experience working in every industry vertical that you can imagine: manufacturing, water, electric, oil, natural gas, you name it, pharma. That's what's really interesting. And we draw on their subject matter expertise frequently when we see something happening that appears to be out of the ordinary. So OT is obviously different. There's a lot of proprietary equipment in OT. There's also proprietary communications protocols used in OT, but a lot of OT today interfaces in some way, shape, or form with enterprise IT. So the threats are going to differ based on the context, really based on what the adversary is looking to do, who the adversary is. It can vary greatly. I'm always impressed with not just the subject matter expertise that I've been able to sort of interact with, but how different the threats can be across some of these industries. Okay, so with that, we can turn it over to questions and answers. Let's take a look. I'll take a look in the Q&A chat first. Please give a real-life example of reputational damage caused by a cyber breach, Sanjeev. There was a credit card company breach a couple of years back. It was in June, and this company basically provides credit ratings for any customer really who's looking to get credit. And by credit, I mean, let's say you want to buy a house or a car and you don't have the money in your bank account. So you apply for credit and then you get a score at the end of that. And this particular company was very negatively impacted by an Apache Struts exploit, and the reputation was greatly damaged. Not to mention they had to pay for identity protection for many of their customers, actually all of their customers, for a couple of years but their reputation was greatly damaged. And that's just one small example of reputational damage caused by a cyber breach. I'm trying to think of one that would be relevant for ICS and OT. Nothing's coming to mind, but I'm sure there's a couple out there. An anonymous attendee said, how much does attribution really matter? That's a great question. And it's actually a very, I think it's a question that comes up all the time. I don't want to say that it doesn't matter. It just helps develop more context. The most important thing really is impact. It doesn't matter who's doing it. It's always really the impact. So from my perspective, how much does attribution really matter? Well, maybe it doesn't matter that much at all. Maybe what we're really interested in, especially in IT, ICS and OT environments, is the impact or the potential impact. So that's a great question. That's a very philosophical question, because it's been posed many times. And actually attribution is a very difficult question to answer, even when you're seeking attribution. So that's why it's a good question. What are the common types of threat intelligence models out there? What are some policies to look at? The diamond model is a very commonly used one. Some of the things for policies you can look at, like there's a bunch of them in NIST creates a bunch of policies like this in the United States. For instance, there's the defense in depth policy. There's actually a policy on how to protect ICS environments too. So there's plenty of information out there, free information, public information to look at that. Many OEMs are pushing Ethernet compatible. Yes, is Modbus or ControlNet. Well, so again, that's a good question because those are proprietary protocols. I would argue that most of this is ported over TCP/IP these days or Ethernet. So it becomes a greater issue of, what's the organization doing? Are they porting Modbus over TCP or DMP3 over TCP? So I don't know that they're any safer, honestly. And the other problem is that even if they're using proprietary protocols, some part of that organization is going to record that, the data historian typically. So there's information available on that. Let's see. Excuse me. Tasit Kim says, comparing to detection system malware such as executable files, what are the main challenges defending firmware malware targeting ICS devices? I think one of the main challenges, and we have a team that does this at Dragos, is keeping up with the changes. A lot of times devices are engineered to be functional before they're engineered to be secure. And we have a team of vulnerability researchers who actually find on a regular basis, probably weekly, daily, weekly, or monthly, vulnerabilities in equipment that is produced by organizations. As OT systems don't have any internet connectivity, how threat intelligence? Well, we don't know that. OT systems may have internet connectivity, maybe by accident or maybe on purpose, and that's part of the issue. So how can threat intelligence be achieved? Well, one of the things that you can do is you can install a device. Dragos makes a device, a platform that will collect information on what's happening. Not only does it do asset identification, but it also will collect information on what is hitting your network, what's looking at your network. Okay, Sean Stakowski says, with Oldsmar, how did the attacker arrive at the decision to attack that organization? That's a great question. Motive, don't know. I don't know that when the sheriff of Oldsmar came on TV, he didn't really have any answer for that. Very interesting stuff. Don't know if it was a random IP scam looking for a vulnerable access point, or what the motive was. But those are great questions, and I don't have the answers to those questions. I don't even know that the Oldsmar facility or the sheriff of Oldsmar has answers to those questions. And that goes back to the question that was asked earlier about attribution. It's tough. It's very difficult. Really that was the impact that was the most frightening, I think. So let's see. Rosario says, how much instead data protection really matter? You mean encrypting data, that sort of thing? I think it matters to some degree, especially with communications between or out, leaving an organization. Does it always work? Probably not. I mean, it's easy to encrypt data, and it's easy to sort of obfuscate all of your important things in that encrypted data. But a lot of the malware that attacks that hits these companies, usually using IT as the initial access vector, it's not going to matter. When will William DeForce says, when will start to become a core of threat intelligence feeds? This is key for security teams, risk management stakeholders, and business stakeholders. Probability. That's a very interesting question, William. I think probability is part of risk assessment, and I think that's very relevant, actually. And I have a white paper that I produced on this topic, actually looking at risk exposure from ransomware in various environments, and probability definitely plays a role in that. So that's actually a good question, but it's a very complicated question to answer in short order. I think I'd have to think about that a little more and give you a more reflective answer later. Ryan says, have there been any incidents where OT hardware has been damaged due to intentional overvolting of power over Ethernet devices? Without being specific, yes, I am aware of some instances like that. Okay, OT systems always installed with antivirus signature-based. So that's another interesting question. A lot of antivirus software isn't made to run on PLC platforms. So where the antivirus lives is in the enterprise OT, which is where, I'm sorry, in the enterprise IT, which is where we want it to live, to prevent, provide block and tackle from people using IT as the initial access vector. What do you do when you run into an organization that doesn't seem to value threat intelligence much? And core employees refuse to read intelligence reports. It might be time to look for another job, my friend. I'm sorry, that's not really good. You do want to be mindful of threat intelligence reports. You do want to be mindful. You want to take the appropriate actions. The best thing you can do for an organization is to be using that threat intelligence to protect your organization. So that's a scary situation you're describing there. Colonial Pipeline, trying to impact ICS or just focused. I don't have any information on that. All I can say is that the impact was huge on the ICS part in Colonial Pipeline. Whether or not the ransomware was trying to affect that, it's not known. And I don't have any evidence or telemetry that says it was, but it did impact the logistics systems, which did impact the Southeast and Eastern United States fuel availability for a short period of time. To Colonial Pipeline's credit, they did restore very quickly. So it was a very complicated attack with some unforeseen, unexpected outcomes, actually. SIEM installed on an OT network should have capable of handling threat intelligence part as well. How Dragos differs from that. This true. SIEMs do typically look at that, and you can configure SIEMs. Dragos is just a solution. It's not the only solution. And, our solution, I think, offers a little more in terms of asset visibility and specific asset protective capability than a generic SIEM. But it's a good question. There are many companies, pharma sector that ignore, since it's a waste of money. Well, unfortunately, I can't speak to that. I don't know that pharma sees it as a waste of money. I do agree that it's probably not a good idea in any sector to ignore ICS OT security, but I don't have any sort of inside knowledge whether pharma purposefully ignores this or deems this a waste of money. The best thing I can say about that is the pharma sector is vulnerable, probably like any other sector, and I'm sure they have enterprise IT, and I hope that somebody's spending time, sort of considering the risks that the enterprise IT poses to exposing the OT. He's coming from pharma inside. Okay, so that's a different conversation. Feel free to reach out with me with more specific questions about that. I'm happy to answer them offline. Do you provide certificate of attendance for CPEs? No. Are there some established cyber intelligence sources from the federal government programs or private companies that are worth using? I think that requires some investigation on your part. DHS has CISA. They tend to look at these things. They definitely look at critical infrastructure protection. They're definitely interested in that. The FBI will investigate, crimes that occur like the Oldsmar breach. So it just depends. I think that there are definitely organizations that are worth using more. I don't want to sort of call anybody out, but yes, I suggest doing some more research on that. Okay.
Okay, I think that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks, Tom, and have a great day.